Welcome to the Free Titan. Today I'm going to continue this series of talks on the planets as gods in Greek mythology. So I've already gone through Venus as Aphrodite and Mars as Ares. And today I'm going to continue by talking about Saturn as Kronos in Greek mythology. Kronos doesn't get talked about as much as many of the other gods, especially Zeus, Hera, Aphrodite, Ares, Apollo, because, and this is the main point, about Saturn and Kronos in the Greek mythology, he's locked up. Basically, they put him in hell. There was a big war between the Titans, the more ancient gods, including Saturn, and the modern gods, let's say, of Zeus and Poseidon, Ares. And the modern gods, especially Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, they locked up their father, Kronos, and put him in hell. They call it Tartarus, but it's like this area underneath the underworld. It's about as like a brutalist place as you can go. And they locked him up there, theoretically, for all of eternity. And there's a lot of stories about the terror and the horror of the Titans escaping their imprisonment in Tartarus. And even in the modern, like in the last 20 years, Hollywood's made like a number of movies about like wars with Titans and things like that. So it still has this place in our collective consciousness, and in our, even in the Christian world, like these Greek myths still really have weight, and we feel their weight on our culture and our society. Because these myths are not, and this is an important point, these myths are not prophetic words. These myths are not necessarily teachings given by a prophet like Jesus Christ or Moses. These are organic inventions or sort of intellectual children of our collective consciousness. And so they're not telling us how things should be necessarily. They're rather describing how we are as a society, as a civilization. And that's why the myths of the Norse differ from the myths of the Greeks, which differ relatively slightly from the myths of the Romans. But the Hindus also have myths about the planets. And I'm sure the Babylonians and Persians did as well, though I'll admit I haven't studied it very much. But in these different civilizations, the myths take on different shapes because they are reflections of that civilization's collective consciousness, of that race of people, with their religion, with their geography, with the way they till the soil and practice, their own morality, the way they look at raising a family or marrying, or different experiences of human life like war and sex and psychology and prayer. All of these different factors influence the way the mythology is given birth to. And for me, one of the sad parts of the modern world is like we've kind of given up on mythology, and that's probably because we're more agnostic than our ancient predecessors. I think ancient people with their less or non-scientific minds found faith in a higher power or in gods living up on some etheric mountaintop much easier to digest. We have become quite obsessed, probably to excess, with science, of only really believing in the power of that which can be proven by the scientific method or by experimentation. But a lot of this sort of divine and most important things in human life can't be proven scientifically, at least not yet. But at any rate, the myths about Kronos are fascinating precisely because he's imprisoned. So the starting point to understanding Saturn is to say, why in Western civilization have we imprisoned Saturn? If you've studied astrology, it shouldn't be too hard to understand why our collective consciousness, and let's not pin this on the Greeks, because in our mythology, he's still imprisoned. We still study these myths, we still write about them and make movies about them. In our collective consciousness, Saturn is still imprisoned in the underworld. Why is he there? Are we better off with him there? And as we start thinking about these big questions, I want to read to you this passage from this ancient Greek writer called Hesiod in his, I guess you'd call it a book. It's not really a book. It's a long poem of wisdom called Works and Days. And he talks a lot about mythology and the sort of origins of the gods and how that affects our society and what the right way to live in our society is, and how different ways of living breed different experiences as civilizations, whether it's war or famine. So it's a rather mystical and spiritual book in many ways, because it's tying these connections between the unseen and the seen. He's tying these connections between how we live, how we act in a moral way, and the sort of economic and political reality in which we live. Now, it's interesting because the Greeks, in their mythology, they in a way felt themselves more progressive by imprisoning Saturn. That is to say, imprisoning Kronos and the Titans. But were they better off? And why are they imprisoned? I think these questions are so vital to not just understanding the nature of Saturn, but to understanding our relationship with what Saturn represents. But before I go into all of those questions, what I want to point your attention to before we even get started is this passage in Hesiod, who's an ancient writer who is much respected by the Greeks. And he talks about the first age, he talks about different ages of human civilization. And when he talks about our current civilization, he says, and this is probably 3,000 years ago, maybe 2,500 years ago at least, he calls our race of men the race of iron. So this would be the race of like the hero, well, no. This would be the race of like the golden age of Athens, let's say. You know, the race that produced Socrates and Plato and the wars, you know, the sort of era you could imagine during the movie 300. This is what I would call the race of iron. Surely the Romans would be included in the race of iron. Would we still be included in that race? Probably, but that's open to interpretation. But anyway, we can call this the modern race of men, of mankind rather, on planet Earth. And it's not very flattering. That's the, so here we go. Far-seeing Zeus then made another race, the fifth, who live now on the fertile earth. I wish I were not of this race, that I had died before or had not yet been born. This is the race of iron. Now, by day men work and grieve unceasingly. By night they waste away and die. The gods will give harsh burdens, but will mingle in some good. Zeus will destroy this race of mortal men when babies shall be born with graying hair, when men will dishonor their parents. And he goes on to list all these things that will happen when this sort of our current race of mankind will be destroyed by God. He continued, one of the other indications will be men will praise the bad and insolent. So you can imagine like our sort of heroes, our demigods in our civilization, these pop stars. I mean, no one's really going to argue that they're morally good men or women. Our politicians, our leaders, the leaders of our world, I don't think anyone's going to really defend them as being morally good. So when we get to this point in civilization where those we praise and sort of raise up and, you know, put on a pedestal and even worship in a way, when these men are bad, when we praise the bad, he talks about we're getting close to the destruction of our civilization, let's say. At least this is the mythological take on it. But during this race, during our current race of mankind, of humankind, Zeus is ruling. So Zeus is the representation of Jupiter, which is considered more benevolent. Like in astrology, we really kind of gravitate towards what Jupiter represents. Jupiter represents prosperity, it represents fertility, it represents pleasure, enjoyment of life. What does Saturn represent? Saturn represents hard work, labor, toil, sickness, stress, endurance. And these are things no one wants to embrace. No, this is the shadow of life, but it's inevitable. This shadow of life, this inevitable difficulty and pain of human existence that everyone experiences at one point or another. And for most people, they experience it regularly. They experience some piece of this every day. Even people who inherit a great deal of wealth and don't have to work, they often experience the most sort of emptiness and anxiety of life, because when you inherit so much and you don't have to work for a goal, you often experience meaninglessness and emptiness. So even those who get to avoid the harsh sort of labor and endurance and toil of Saturn, often they're the most miserable. And I think this is ultimately the point that I will build on in this talk, is that we in our civilization have mythologically or metaphorically imprisoned Saturn and what Saturn represents. The initiation, the trial of life, the pain, the struggle, the discipline, the self-restraint to practice basic sort of tenets of morality like loyalty and hard work. This is the good of what Saturn represents. If you think of construction, Saturn is the foundation. When you have loyalty and a hard work and a good work ethic, and if nothing else, that's what Saturn represents. It's quite simple. And self-restraint, discipline. When you have these qualities and you practice them habitually, when you habitually practice these qualities of Saturn, life unfolds. And this same author, Hesiod, who I quite like, he talks about how the bad way, the way of immorality and taking shortcuts is easy at first, and it seems to bear fruit at first, but in the long run, it just turns to, it turns sour, it goes bad, it's acid. But the long path of hard work and loyalty and self-discipline, this in the end, it's bitter at first, but in the end it turns, it yields the best fruits, right? It yields the most prosperity that stays with you, that's not lost. So he says, badness can be caught in great abundance easily. The road to her is level and she lives nearby. But good is harder, for the gods have placed in front of her much sweat. This is Saturn. The gods have placed in front of the good much sweat. The road is steep and long and rocky at the first, but when you reach the top, she is not hard to find. And she, in this case, is abundance. So he's even talking about prosperity. He's talking about how you accrue wealth, how you accrue abundance, how you accrue or acquire that which you desire in life, whether it's partnership, financial abundance, peace, stability. If you try to acquire these things in the short run through badness, it will escape you. You will lose it. It will run away. If you acquire these things through patient labor and sweat and morality, following a nice moral code, then they will stay. They will take longer to acquire, but when you get them, they will stay, and you will have peace in life, and you will die a happy old man. Essentially, this is the idea. This is not a novel thought. I think everyone kind of instinctively understands this, but I would venture to say most people in this world don't really incorporate this wisdom into their daily life. Like, you see a lot of shortcuts, a lot of sort of litigious behavior where you're trying to get someone else's money through immoral means, like through a frivolous lawsuit or something like that. This is the path to ruin, at least in terms of his way of looking at the world, and it's certainly in terms of Saturn's way of looking at the world. And so my point in all of this is that mythologically we have imprisoned Kronos, who is the representation of Saturn, not because Kronos is evil, but because we, in our laziness, in our inability to accept the darkness and pain and shadow of life as necessary and as good in itself, want to avoid that responsibility in living. And so in our collective consciousness, we imprison Saturn. And I'm going to jump to another point in Hesiod where he talks about the golden age, the first age of humankind, which was not ruled with Zeus on Mount Olympus, but was before the war between the gods. And this was when Kronos himself, when Saturn ruled Mount Olympus, when Saturn was the authority on earth, when Saturn and what he represents, this discipline, this integrity, this embracing of hard work, of the difficulty in life as the path to ultimate happiness, when this ruled earth, we were in the golden age of humankind. So Hesiod writes, and now with art and skill I'll summarize another tale which you should take to heart, of how both gods and men began the same. The gods who live on Mount Olympus first fashioned a golden race of mortal men. These lived in the reign of Kronos, king of heaven, and like the gods they lived with happy hearts, untouched by work or sorrow. Interesting that he says untouched by work or sorrow, because what Kronos represents is work. And my interpretation of this would be when generationally these quote unquote burdens are not shirked, right? When generationally loyalty, respect, hard work are observed, wealth is gained in a moral way, and then this morally gained wealth is passed on to one's heirs. There is still work, and this is a mythology, so maybe it's exaggerated when he says they were untouched by work. But ultimately, what my vision of it perceives is that when generationally these traits are passed on, right? When there's respect and loyalty between husband and wife, when children are raised in a happy household, when they are raised with a good work ethic, when they embrace the struggle of life with a smile on their face and stoicism in their hearts, when these are commonplace virtues in a society, peace reigns, prosperity reigns, health reigns. And that's what I think this means. Untouched by work or sorrow, vile old age never appeared, but always lively limbed. Far from all ills they feasted happily, death came to them as sleep, and all good things were theirs. Ungrudgingly the fertile land gave up her fruits, unasked. Happy to be at peace, they lived with every want supplied, rich in their flocks and dear to the blessed gods. So it's so fascinating because, and this is not the only place where they talk about the golden age of humankind being ruled by Saturn. In another book of mythology, we have another reference to this, and the reference specifically talks about how much the Romans associated Kronos with the golden age. And I'll read, and we can kind of pivot into the more modern ideas of Kronos now. I just wanted to plant these ideas in your heads about what Saturn really is and why we're scared of him. And I, more than anything, want to plant this idea that when what Saturn represents and the difficulty of life, which he represents, is embraced wholeheartedly, right? We're not running away from the difficulty of life. We're facing it and embracing it and taking on our burdens in life and taking on our life lessons. And we're taking on this struggle of human existence and the human condition with stoicism and strength. This yields happiness. When one generation does this, this is their greatest inheritance that they can pass on to their children, is this attitude towards life. And this attitude ultimately breeds and brings everything that we want in life. But the way, it's like in Dante, the path to heaven first goes through hell. Now, is Saturn hell? No. We've made Saturn hell by being scared of Saturn. We've made Saturn hell by being scared of hard work and discipline. And this attitude has become so much more rampant in the last 20 or 30 years, where, you know, I'm 35 and my generation, certainly the generation that is younger than me, it's like, it seems like this devotion to hedonism, this devotion to ease of life, this devotion to finding a path through life, the path to always taking the path of least resistance through life. This has become so commonplace that Saturn has represented more and more and more of a hell to them. Because if you've lived like that your whole life and you get to 25 or 30 and you want to have a family, it's going to be hard to not run away from this responsibility. It's going to be hard to not run away from the burden of life, which when taken on with strength ultimately is what leads to happiness. This idea is repeated so many times in our great literature, certainly in Dante. It's like, this is maybe the most obvious expression of it, where you have, you know, hell, purgatory, and paradise. And Dante, led by Virgil, goes through all three, but he starts in hell. And it kind of shows how through this process of suffering and toil, we are purified on our way to heaven. And when you get to heaven, it's more of an effortless experience of God's grace. But yeah, this is what Saturn represents. And I think, you know, the more, interestingly enough, as an aside, the more we collectively turn away from Saturn's lessons, Saturn's initiations, the more we empower this kind of, we leave this vacuum in our society because we're not taking on our shadow. We're not taking on our lessons. But like the necessity to hold this space of our collective shadow still exists, and someone will hold that space. And you can fill in the blanks here on your own, but you know, some entity will fill in this space for us. Someone is going to take that power from us because we're not taking it for ourselves. Because when we take on these lessons and we work at life lessons and we work at our relationship with our parents, we work at our relationship with our spouse, we take on We have an honorable livelihood where we're not cheating other people out of their money. When all these things are met, we become more powerful. We become more morally integrated, you could say. We integrate our shadow and we grow in strength from that experience. If we're not doing that, our shadow is still hanging out there somewhere, and someone can take advantage of it, and someone probably will take advantage of it. And that gets into a little bit more of an esoteric conversation than I'm probably ready to get into right now, but it's an interesting starting point to think about it. So, having said all that, the mythology of Kronos specifically is not talked about that much because it's not that exciting. There's not that many myths about him. Like with Zeus, there's endless myths about his romantic endeavors and just having children with mortals and gods, and the lessons of these things, and being pursued by his jealous wife Hera. It's all very dramatic. Now the mythology behind Kronos could equally be considered dramatic, but it's quite dark. It's more tragic than entertaining. So I'll just read this short summary of the mythology of Saturn and Kronos in Greek mythology. So Kronos was the son of Kronos, the sky god, and Gaia, the earth mother. So you can imagine the most timeless manifestation of any divinity that could be perceived by a human being living on earth would be the sky and the earth. So they gave a sort of male deity to represent the sky, and a female deity to represent Mother Earth, which is still a sort of easy idea for us to understand intuitively. With the help of Gaia, Kronos emasculated his father Kronos and seized control of the universe. Now, why is this? This was because Kronos, the original sort of father figure in the mythology, in the divinity, was somewhat of a tyrant, and he wasn't treating his family well, right? Like he wasn't treating his children well, which in turn is what Kronos does to his children. So there's this tyrannical archetype of the father, which, if you're avoiding Saturn comes at you with trials and pain, whether or not you're facing him. So if you're turning away and running away from the trials and pain of life, you would say life is a tyrant. But really, this tyranny is just trying to make you stronger. If you face it and you learn from it, you become stronger. But if collectively, in our collective consciousness, we don't want to take that on in this current, the race of iron, they called it, not the golden age of men, but in the race of iron, we're turning away from our struggles and our discipline and our initiations in life, then that part of human existence, at least, becomes tyrannical. So Kronos then cuts off the genitals of his father as punishment for his tyranny, and then marries his sister Rhea, and follows the example of Kronos, his father, by disposing of his children by swallowing them, because he had been warned that he would become displaced by one of his sons, which ultimately happens because one of his sons, Zeus, deposes of him and imprisons him in Tartarus. Rhea, however, gave him a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead of the infant Zeus, his youngest son, who was taken secretly to Crete in order to grow up safely on the island. When Zeus came of age, he forced Kronos to vomit up his brothers and sisters. So like Kronos ultimately eats his progeny, and they're eventually freed from him by his son. So there's this generational pattern which is continued. So he vomits up his brothers and sisters, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter. And to release his uncles and aunts, especially the Titans, whom Kronos had chosen to keep chained up, in gratitude, etc., etc. So, and then it continues where it says Romans acquitted Kronos with Saturn and associated him with the Golden Age. So there's this really strange paradox of Kronos being this cannibalistic tyrant, and yet at the same time there's this association of him with the Golden Age, which I've already talked about quite a bit. And in short, to sum up my point again here, when we face the shadow of life, when we embrace with open arms the difficulty of the human experience, when we embrace that trials and tribulations are coming to us with the purpose of making us better, wiser, stronger, more humble, and more compassionate, then we live in the Golden Age. Then Saturn rules the earth. and we recognize him as the bringer of all that is good ultimately, and the bringer of all sort of peace and prosperity which is meant to endure. When we turn away from this and we want life to be easier and wealth to be more easy to acquire, when we shun morality for taking shortcuts, then Saturn becomes a tyrant. When we're scared of the toil of life, when we're scared of this process of living, which is more difficult, Saturn becomes a tyrant. And then we collectively want to lock him up. And so when we look at Saturn in astrology, for example, this is a very easy pattern to see, because Saturn is in astrology the most feared of the planets. Because Saturn brings trials, Saturn brings difficulties, Saturn brings that which we don't want, but that which makes us grow. It's like rain. You know, there's a lot of things you cannot do on a rainy day, but yet rain is what makes the crops grow. Rain is ultimately what feeds us. Saturn similarly brings us trials and tribulations, but without that, we would become spoiled and lazy and weak, and we would be lacking in wisdom. It's like, there's another saying the Greeks had in one of their tragedies that I really like, that is, wisdom is the child of pain. And Saturn also represents wisdom. So Saturn is pain, Saturn is wisdom, Saturn is playing the long game in life, and playing the long game with humility and patience and perseverance. And when we can embrace that, we're really able to flourish spiritually. So in astrology, Saturn is considered a very important planet spiritually. But this is a way of looking at life which is much more mature, much more disciplined, much more in tune with sort of self-renunciation and self-sacrifice. So the whole Christian morality is actually very Saturnian, like this self-sacrifice in order to find freedom, self-sacrifice in order to lose oneself, in order to find oneself in Christ. And so this emphasis on service, this emphasis on selfless morality, this emphasis on humility before God, this is so Saturnian. The message of Christ was very Saturnian, and yet it's very liberating. It's very liberating, and Christ is not the only illuminated being to talk about self-sacrifice. In Hinduism, many of the most revered gods are very Saturnian in their representation and their morality. Specifically, you could talk about Kali and Shiva. And these are liberating gods, just as Christ is a liberating, I know we don't want to call him a god in sort of Hindu or in Christian terms, but he's a liberator. He's a messianic figure who liberates us from the pain and the suffering and the misery of human experience when we are living in a selfish way. Now, it's interesting because when you look at the Christian religion or the Hindu religion, you find very mature ways of looking at what Saturn represents, because they have elevated as their god what Saturn is, which is selflessness and humility, long-suffering, doing what's right even when it's not easy for you, and continuing to do what's right even if you lose everything you have. Like the book of Job, for example, in the Old Testament is very much what's purely a Saturnian story, where, you know, like God's talking with Satan, I think, and Satan says, and God points out and says, look at my son Job, look how good of a devotee he is, right? Look how good of a devotee he is to God, look how moral he is, look how good of a man he is. And Satan says, well, he's been given everything. He has a good family, he has wealth, he has everything a man could want. And Satan says, surely if you take those things away from him, he won't love you. And God says, well, let's test him. So little by little, Job loses everything he has, everything which could give a man happiness. And finally, through all these trials, Job continues in his devotion and love of God. And so this is very similar with the Christian experience, where, like, you know, in all of the trials life can throw at us, and all of the pain and misery and suffering that life can hurl at us, we maintain our devotion to this ideal, whether it's through Christ, whether it's through Shiva in Hindu terms, whether it's through Saturn and humility in astrological terms, through this self-dying, this self-sacrifice to a higher ideal. Like Paul said, by the grace of Christ, I die daily. This is another Saturnian ideal. And so I think all of the highest religious and moral expressions become Saturnian. And the problem is not that Saturn gives us trials, because ultimately trials liberate us, whether it's in a Christian context. Christ and his teachings are here to liberate us. In an astrological context, Saturn and his lessons and difficulties and pain are here to liberate us and make us wise and selfless and humble. And in a Hindu context, well, Kali and Shiva represent this renunciation of the world, this turning inward, this embracing of life's difficulties and pains in order to grow spiritually. These things liberate us. The other sort of moralities and divinities, they might make life easy and pleasant in the short run, but in the long run, they're not emancipating us from this. You could call it the slavery of human bondage, of this, in sort of Eastern terms, this cyclical reincarnation and going through this misery of human life over and over and over again, of sickness and old age and struggling for money, and just this desperation and depression of human life. When we turn inward and we embrace this Saturnian archetype of struggling, and this work ethic, right? This selfless sacrifice. That's when we really break the chains. And so mythologically, Saturn being imprisoned is not a very good indication of where we are at as a society. Now, in Christian terms, Saturn is free. Saturn is free. Christ freed Saturn. The Old Testament freed Saturn. They revered what he represented, this difficulty, right? These trials and tribulations. I mean, everything in biblical terms is about growing through trials and tribulations and God testing us in order to grow in our sacrifice and our devotion to God. So this is a nice background for Saturn and the sort of whole Saturnian archetype mythologically and religiously, and what these myths represent. And it's interesting because what the myths represent isn't necessarily the highest moral expression or the highest spiritual expression. It's simply an expression of where we are at. And so like astrology, mythology, and I've said this before, it shows us kind of where we are at. But I think if we want to look at where we really need to go as a civilization, as humankind, as individuals, we're much better off looking at the sort of high moral teachings of prophets, like Christ, who really showed us the way to get to who we want to be, how to get there, the way to get there. And inevitably, it all comes back to Saturn and sort of embracing these Saturnian qualities, which I've now talked about at length.